Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 11th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one that is to come, or are we to wait for another?" And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist, and yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
Please be seated. Some years ago, Jeanette and I flew out to the West Coast to visit with family. First, we visited with my aunt who lived in a suburb of Portland, Oregon. And next, we went to visit her brother Brian in Corvallis, Oregon. And then we drove down along the coast to California, stopping along the way in the Napa Valley, San Francisco, and even taking a side trip over to Yosemite National Park, before finally ending up at her brother Mike's, who lived in Los Angeles at the time. During our stay in the Los Angeles area, we did all the touristy things, of course. We drove all around Hollywood, went past the Rose Bowl, checked out the mansions in Beverly Hills, did the Universal Studio tour, even saw the Queen Mary docked down in Long Beach. As a side note, this was the very same vessel that doubled as a troop ship during World War II, and ironically even took my own dad across the Atlantic to fight in Europe. But then over the weekend, Jeanette's brother Mike took us for a ride in his car farther south along the coast before turning inland and climbing up into the mountains. And once we reached the highest point on top of this one particular ridge, he pulled the car over into a scenic overlook. Pointing to the east, Mike asked if we could see a small patch of green far away in the middle of the desert. Naturally we could, but it was far enough away that from our vantage point way up there in the mountains, it looked like nothing more than a bright green postage stamp in an otherwise desolate landscape. "What is it?" we asked him. "Palm Springs," he replied. And then we got back into his car, we drove down the mountain over to that bright green oasis in the middle of the California desert. And sure enough, just as we crossed over into the city limits, the barren desert of sand and rock suddenly turned into lush green lawns shaded by leafy palm trees. It was like we had entered into a completely different world, night and day, in fact. And after briefly checking things out, including driving by Bob Hope's magnificent home, he was still living then, conspicuously sitting up in all of its majestic splendor on a slight hill that even further emphasized its opulence, we then drove out the other side of Palm Springs, where we were once again immediately greeted by barren, dry desert. My point is that obviously it's possible to turn even the driest and most barren desert into an oasis of green grass and leafy palms if you have enough water, that is. I've read where the residents of Palm Springs consume on average 1,233 cubic meters of water each year, which is about twice as much as the average home in the U.S., a country which is, not surprisingly, has one of the highest consumption rates of water in the entire world. In order to do that, however, and to also keep the roughly 100 local golf courses in Palm Springs lusciously green, they not only rely on an underground aquifer, but they also pump water all the way from the Colorado River and even rely on melting ice from the surrounding mountains. Well, as we heard in our first reading this morning, the prophet Isaiah once talked about a desert that would blossom, how waters would break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert where the burning sand would become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. He wasn't talking about Palm Springs, was he? Now, he was talking about what would happen in the day of the Lord when all of creation, mind you, not just us, not just human beings, would be restored and redeemed. In other words, for the prophet, God would come to heal the whole world, the entire world, not just part of it. We live in a time, however, where we have seemingly lost this connection to the world around us and to God's creation. We live in a time where we primarily view ourselves as takers, that is, those who take from God's good earth, rather than as caretakers, or those who've been entrusted with the great privilege and responsibility to protect and preserve nature and all living things. The late Joseph Sittler, one of the most well-known and respected Lutheran theologians of the 20th century, once wrote about attending 3 different conferences on the subject of the environment. And the first was held at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, and it dealt with the obligation of the scientific community for the environment. Attending this conference were physical chemists, cosmographers, astrophysicists, physicists, agricultural experts, and others. The conference was characterized, he says, by carefully written, data-rich, and responsible papers on all aspects of the environment, its present state, its fragility, and what must be done to preserve the ecological structure of the world. And at the end of the 6-day meeting, a press conference was then held, and a small committee that had been assigned to prepare a summary statement came to a remarkable conclusion, at least in Sittler's opinion. They concluded that there is much that the scientific community can do and much more that we propose to do about the care of the environment. But no conceivable enhancement of research methodology, they said, no conceivable addition of public funds, no cries of warning will make any considerable difference until we are all changed in the spirit of our minds. And then Sittler went to another conference, this one held at the University of Chicago and attended by professors from the country's leading law schools. And the topic was, what is the role of public law in the care and protection of the environment? The lawyers also presented serious papers, but what caught Sittler's eye was the press release issued at the end of it. You see, it was almost identical to the one issued by the Conference of Scientists, he noted. There's much that public law ought to do and will do for the environment, but no conceivable operation of public law by itself, however, will provide any significant solution to human misuse of the earth. And then the third conference he attended was actually a much more informal gathering, this time of pastors, but yet on the very same topic. And during this meeting, a well-respected clergyman offered what Sittler believed was a particularly foolish statement, and one that apparently was not challenged by the other clergy at the gathering either. "This is my Father's world," said the minister somewhat pompously. "This is God's world. And if God wants us to take care of the world in a certain way, and we don't, then God will certainly, in his way, look after things no matter what we do." Sittler was amazed, to say the least. The conferences of both the leading minds in science and also the legal profession in our country not only pledged that they would do whatever they could in their respective fields to protect nature and the environment, but they also both realized and confessed that there was a limit to what they could do in each of these respective fields until and unless there was a corresponding change of mind and perspective on everyone's part, not just the scientists and lawyers, but everyone, all of us. And obviously Sittler approved of these thoughts and positions. But as much as he understood and agreed with what the scientists and lawyers had said, on the other hand, he was deeply disappointed, if not disturbed, by how his fellow clergy looked at and felt about this very same issue. Their attitude was, oh well, if we don't do it, in other words, if we don't protect and care for the earth, then God will somehow intervene and just do it for us. Fellow students of Scripture who should have known better, who should have remembered what the creation accounts in Genesis tell us, who should have recalled what the prophet Isaiah described in today's reading, were basically arguing that the care of the earth and all living things was really not our responsibility. And not only that, but even today we often hear leading Christian thinkers completely dismissing this whole idea of caring for creation because in the end it won't really matter, they say. Why? Because when Christ returns, we'll all be beamed up to heaven like Captain Kirk on Star Trek. In other words, caring for the earth and for the environment is unnecessary and irrelevant for them. In fact, some even believe that the sooner we mess it all up down here on earth, perhaps the sooner that Christ will come again to save and protect us and deliver us. But Isaiah offers a completely different vision, a completely different view of how God will renew and redeem and restore our world, doesn't he? In today's reading, he describes for us a time when not only will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf be unstopped, not only will the lame be able to run and leap and the tongues of the speechless sing for joy, but it will also be a time when all of creation, all of nature, all living things will be transformed. As Michael Chan writes for Isaiah 35, salvation is imagined in creational terms. The general theme, he writes, is that desolate, dry places will be transformed into paradise. Not only that, but as Doug Bratt reminds us, we recognize that God calls us to help God care for everything God creates. In other words, if God's promise to transform and renew if God promises to transform and renew creation, then we are called to be a part of that redemptive work ourselves. On another one of our vacations, my family and I took a trip to Shenandoah National Park in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. If you've ever been there, and if you've ever driven along the famous Skyline Drive, then you've had the distinct privilege of experiencing some of the most beautiful views of nature in our entire country. And as you drive along Skyline Drive and just take it in and soak in all the gorgeous scenery, especially the lush green forests that cover the mountains, it's hard to imagine that there was a time, less than 100 years ago in fact, that large swaths all across these mountains were completely bare and barren. All the trees having been cut down, thus leaving the ridges and peaks about as sparse as the top of my head is these days. You see, back in the 19th century, as railroads now span the entire continent, they demanded an almost endless supply of timber for railroad ties, the result being deforestation on a grand scale. Moreover, in a time before synthetics, leather was used for everything from footwear to the drive belts that transferred power from wood-powered steam engines. And this leather was processed with tannic acid that came from, you guessed it, the bark of trees. Yet another excuse to cut down forests. Moreover, the Shenandoah Valley was also a national center of iron production throughout the 19th century because it had, or at least was close to, abundant supplies of iron ore, limestone, and charcoal, the three necessary ingredients for iron production. And typically 1 to 6 acres of trees were required to produce the charcoal needed for just a single day's output of an iron furnace, upwards of 17 to 1,800 acres per year per furnace. And so needless to say, by the time they got around to creating Shenandoah National Park, they had a lot of restoration and a lot of tree planting to do. In fact, I remember seeing old photographs in the visitor center that depicted just how bare and barren those mountaintops and ridges had actually become. And now, again, just less than a century later, you wouldn't know that there was a time when large swaths throughout the park were nearly treeless. In other words, it's amazing what we can do if we want to, that is, to transform the world around us for the better. And again, as Christians, it's that very same kind of transformation and redemptive work in the world that we are called to participate in as caretakers of God's good earth, and also as those who believe in and look forward to the day when God will heal and restore not just us, but the entire creation. In the Bible, we hear about God's invitation to enjoy the fruits of creation, but we also hear the call to be tenders of the garden. We also hear, especially in the creation accounts, the reminder that this planet we live on is a gift. In other words, the world is not our rival or our enemy or something to be conquered and exploited. Rather, it is a beautiful garden, bountiful garden that we have been called to tend. Martin Luther once wrote, God is entirely present personally and essentially in the Christ on earth in his mother's womb, in the crib, in the temple, in the wilderness, in cities, in houses, but also, he says, in the gardens and in the fields. In other words, the call to care for creation is the call to draw near to the presence of God in the world around us and in the restored relationships between us and our neighbors, but also in the life-giving relationship between humans and the land. And we are further reminded that good news for creation is good news for people living in poverty as well, those who are particularly vulnerable to the worst effects of climate change and damage to the environment. Again, God's promise, as the prophet Isaiah makes clear in this morning's reading, is for the reconciliation of all of creation, of a time when the desert shall rejoice and blossom, and when waters shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Amen. Please stand for the hymn of the day.